You're listening to The Discovery Pod, a podcast dedicated to conversations with leaders in the social profit sector. Discover the origin stories of CEOs, founders, and other senior leaders and learn from them so you can accomplish what is most important. Now, on with the show with your host, Douglas Nelson.
Hello, and welcome to The Discovery Pod, Conversations with Social Profit Leaders. Our guest on the show today is Andrew Chunilall. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Community Foundations of Canada. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. Glad to be part of the Discovery Pod series. Thank you, Douglas.
For our few listeners that may not know what the Community Foundations of Canada organization is, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you guys do?
Sure. So Community Foundations, there's a global network of community foundations across the world, almost 2,000 institutions globally. There's 191 community foundations in Canada, and those community foundations cover almost 90% of the Canadian population. The oldest community foundation, the first one in Canada, was in Winnipeg, and the Winnipeg Foundation is coming up on its centennial celebration next year. So that represents 100 years of the Canadian Community Foundation movement. Each community foundation is independently led and independently governed by the community. And the real benefit and value of that is that each community has the ability to decide what its own priorities are, develop very local expertise and knowledge, and able to connect philanthropy to the issues that matter most to each one of those communities. And so it's a network that's proliferated significantly in the last 20 years. Community Foundations of Canada is only coming up on 28 years old. And when we were established, there was less than 30 community foundations in Canada. And so in less than 30 years, we've grown that number by 6 times. So a very robust, strong network of philanthropic institutions.
And you've been in your role as the CEO for a little over 6.5 years. What are the changes that you've seen, or what are the issues that are new today that weren't the case or weren't being dealt with when you became CEO?
You know, it's been a fascinating 6 years. Philanthropy and community organizations have changed lock and step in much the same way that Canada's changed. The demographics of the country, as everybody knows, are shifting in dramatic ways. We are an aged country, which has a significant impact on healthcare, on long-term care, on any type of service that's directed to older people. We have a smaller proportion of our population that's working, and that creates a strain and an extra burden on government. And philanthropy plays an important role in partnering and trying to alleviate a lot of those pressures. But we also see a country that's diversifying dramatically. You know, our birth rate is 1.7. The replacement rate is 2.1. The only portion of the Canadian population that has a high birth rate is the Indigenous population. It's just under 5. But when you combine that with an aged population, we are at risk of population decline, which then means we are heavily reliant on immigration just to have population neutrality. And so with an investment in immigration, and we continue to be diverse, multicultural, plural society. And one of the challenges of philanthropy is really shifting into that diversity and in engaging all Canadians in making community decisions and democratizing philanthropy.
In the role that you have and being able to see how 191 different community foundations are dealing with those issues, what are some of the best practices that you're seeing in terms of recognizing the changing demographics and diversity of the Canadian population?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we have a lot of work to do, but community foundations are deeply vested in diversifying, I would say radically diversifying their boards and their teams. Community Foundations of Canada has taken much effort to engage in the reconciliation process in Canada with Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And we are seeing that more and more boards have representation from Indigenous communities, are seeking to have gender balance on their teams and boards, and reaching out to those communities where philanthropy traditionally hasn't reached out to, and ensuring those marginalized communities, younger generations are being represented within the community decision-making process. And so once you have that level of diversity and inclusion, you tend to get optimal results in how you exercise philanthropy and advance social outcomes in those communities.
I would certainly echo that. The organizations that we work across the country that really do reflect the diversity, both in age and ethnicity and gender across the country, those organizations are the ones that are having the most dynamic, interesting conversations about the role of philanthropy and the role of mission-based organizations. The ones that have not yet gone down that path or have failed to do so tend to be stuck in a different place. And the conversations they're having are a little stale. And in a lot of ways, the revenue reflects that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What are the, so on the podcast, we've had a number of CEOs of community foundations across the country. And one of the things that really comes to the fore in all of their conversations is just how incredibly rooted in their local community these organizations are. It's not only in the name, but it's often in the way that they operate on a day-to-day basis and all of their granting and their conversation with donors. From a national perspective, how do you pull that diversity of local experience together into a coherent whole or a place where people can share best practice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we refer to our community foundations as a network and as a movement. And we do so because we recognize that although these institutions, as you say, are deeply rooted in local, there's a role to play when we bring them all together in how we can act regionally, provincially, and across Canada. Issues like I mentioned, reconciliation, but in addition to that, climate change and the welcoming of newcomers and setting a new pathway and a vision for communities across the country in terms of how we look at city building or investments in rural and small, mid-sized communities across the country all require a collective effort. We've got many good examples of how that's happened in the past. A number of years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, you'll recall that Canada welcomed well over 30,000 refugees from Syria. And the Community Foundation network came together. We identified where those refugees were going and then helped direct resources and leverage and social capital into those communities to provide for a rapid and healthy integration of those Syrian refugees into all communities. And that was a coordinated effort across our network where people were sharing best practices, reaching out to one another, staying connected, and just developing a lot of intelligence around how we can welcome newcomers and provide job training, education, and just a feeling of belonging. A lot of these folks were uprooted because of war and resettlement in a new country, a different culture, language, etc., is extremely traumatic and challenging. And so having those community foundations working together was critical.
Mm-hmm. One of my observations about the community foundation movement has been you've got these great organizations, really dedicated professionals leading them and working in them, great boards. But they're often fairly anonymous in their community in terms of the profile that they have. Is that inherent in the movement, you think? That humility or understated way of being, or is that an opportunity for these organizations to tell their story in a louder voice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting pattern that you've identified. I think there is a tremendous amount of humility. I also think that community foundations understand the importance of collaboration in the community and their role in collaborating. And although we see ourselves as leaders in the community, we're careful not to crowd out other leaders as well. And so oftentimes you'll find us behind the scenes, very influential, very active, but we like to see that those that are doing the really important work on the ground are being profiled and recognized for what they're doing. And that's just part of our culture. It's part of our brand. And we fundamentally believe that the true leadership in the community, those people that are working in front lines and within those agencies are the ones that need to be out front and center.
And it must be a tension that happens around at least 191 board tables, but that be often being one of the larger organizations in a community or among the larger organizations. And a number of the CEOs that I've spoken with say, well, we're not a fundraising organization. We're not a fundraising organization. Yet in terms of receipted dollars, they're often one of the largest in their community. Mm-hmm. How do leaders in the movement balance that, or what is the approach to balancing that need to receive those funds to continue to do the good work without being viewed as competing with other operational charities?
The community foundations have a very specific business model, and they're really engaging and developing relationships with a specific type of philanthropy, a specific type of donor. And for the most part, there aren't a lot of other available options for those donors other than a community foundation or establishing a private foundation on their own, or going to a financial institution and engaging in a commercial gift fund. So it's a very narrow field, and we don't believe that takes away in any way from what others are doing. And as you know, our business model is predicated on supporting other charities and nonprofits and communities and helping them in whatever way possible. We see that that's very strong and vibrant charitable sector in any community is key to that particular community's resilience and ability to advance the outcomes that they want to see improve.
I think what we've seen in the donors that we've worked with is that people are often donors. They have a fund at the community foundation and are actively involved in other organizations as well during their life. They may choose to leave their estate to the community foundation so that can continue on in perpetuity. But the donors don't seem to see it as a choice between one or the other because they're often selecting both.
Correct.
In my experience in the United States, working in a hospital there and reading the headlines, that Fidelity was the largest charity in the world. The growth of these commercial gift funds or donor-advised funds that are offered through financial institutions really have become a part of the conversation here in Canada. What are you hearing from community foundations about how they're managing those conversations with prospective donors when donors are choosing between a commercial DAF and a fund with the community foundation?
Uh-huh. Yeah, it really is the difference between wanting to have a transactional relationship with your philanthropy, and that's where commercial gift funds do an excellent job. They're quite efficient at the transactional level, whereas a community foundation will offer the transactional plus the relational, and it has its ability to take the donor into some very specific issues in a local community. So I can, you could look at a small community. You could look at Whistler, BC, or West Vancouver, or Grand Prairie. And we have institutions, community foundations in those communities that have diverse boards, that have exceptional leadership, and a ton of knowledge that's been created and accumulated over many years. And then, so when a donor comes in, is seeking advice on where they want to have an impact, that community foundation is bringing all that to bear in the decision-making process and in the advisor process. At the commercial gift fund level, if we're talking about Fidelity, I don't know that Fidelity has people on the ground in Whistler or in Grand Prairie or in West Vancouver developing knowledge and experience and social capital that will help their customers. It's more of a centralized process that sends money out. The process that we run is more bottoms up. It's decentralized, and it's about knowledge, and it's about social capital, and it's about relationships.
Yeah. Would you like to see community foundations doing more to promote that local expertise and their ability to convene groups around particular issues than they're currently doing?
I can appreciate there's a perception that we're not advocating or our voice is not loud enough in that particular niche that we operate in or our value proposition. I would argue the contrary. I think we are doing a lot. I think, we don't run big campaigns. You won't see, commercials or billboards. But our people are actively involved in conversations every day We're talking about the value of community foundations. We're developing those relationships primarily through professional advisors. So these would be financial advisors, accountants, lawyers, insurance professionals. All of those people to have some level of knowledge and understanding of a community foundation, and then are able to help and assist their own clients in philanthropy. And we receive a lot of inbound, much inbound through professional advisors, and bringing in new donors and new partners to the community foundation platform.
Mm-hmm. When you bring your 191 community foundations together, or some subset of them, you mentioned the issues around diversity and demographics. Are there other issues in philanthropy that are coming to the fore right now that different foundations are taking different approaches on?
There's so much happening, particularly in the last 3 years around philanthropy. And we're in this time where philanthropy is being looked at with a critical point of view. And, a lot of the issues that we're grappling with in Canada and throughout the world are a consequence of this proliferation of inequality. And there's a lot of discussion around capitalism and whether the version of capitalism that has brought us here, that has created a tremendous amount of wealth and prosperity, particularly in the Western world, is that the type of capitalism that's going to take us forward? And I think where philanthropy, particularly community foundations, are looking at is, what's our role in understanding that? And so what I mean by that is community foundations are the holders of significant amounts of financial capital. Well, we talked about donors. Well, those donors and that capital is typically a consequence of capitalism. And so we've been reliant upon that to build our own base and to legitimize ourselves as players in the community. And, the other part of that, the extension of that, is we also invest that capital in the capital markets to earn a return on investment that provides for granting in the community, that provides for all sorts of leadership initiatives in the community, that keeps the lights on and that pays for staff. And those are good things, but they're a consequence of that same capitalism that is creating some of the challenges that we're also trying to solve on the back end. So it's an interesting paradox for us to consider, but we also see that there's a significant amount of growth, particularly from this younger generation, in social enterprise. And so these are organizations, corporations, nonprofits that varied bottom line that can have an environmental focus, a social focus, and a profitable focus. And we see that as something that is very much on the future agenda for impact in this country and across the world.
Absolutely. Is there a role for community foundations in helping to grow those social enterprises?
Yeah, absolutely. And, Community Foundations of Canada has a recent partnership with the federal government and has established the Investment Readiness Fund. And this is a fund, we are one of 5 partners across the country, and the holders of around $50 million collectively to help ready the field of impact practitioners across Canada for investments in social enterprises. And so we're in the early stages of it, but our federal government and our sector realize the importance of this in advancing outcomes in a new way in Canada.
It's really on the top of mind of a lot of boards and a lot of the organizations we're working with when we're doing strategic planning exercises. The question of should we get into social enterprise? And I normally try to move the agenda along at that point because that's not really where you want to start that conversation at a strategic planning retreat. But I think more and more organizations and boards are going to need to get their heads around what it means to have that diversified income in order to sustain services, in order to sustain the community or deliver on the mission they have. Is there a role for the Community Foundation in supporting other organizations as they go down that path?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a unique challenge with social enterprises, and that's their ability to raise capital. They're sort of caught in this unknown place. So they're not a corporation, a for-profit corporation. And so the ability to issue share capital, the ability to take on debt, the ability to seek investment is super challenging. And so how do these social enterprises attract capital to do the work that they want to do? On the other side of it, they're not purely charities either. And so they don't necessarily attract donors or government funding in the same way that others do. And so that's another alternative to raising capital that they're kind of shut out of in many ways. And so they're caught in between. And I think that's an opportunity for organizations like community foundations. I mentioned there's 191 of them. Collectively, we would hold somewhere around $6 billion of assets at the Canadian-wide level. Some of that capital can be activated and invested in that market that's looking for capital to do good. And right now, a lot of our leaders and boards are grappling with how we can make that happen in a responsible way, in a way that achieves the outcomes that we want and attracts new learnings and new possibilities about the future.
Right. And I imagine those are difficult conversations around the board because the chair of the investment committee's mandate is to maximize the return so there's more money available to invest in the priorities of the foundation, or the priorities of the donors. And often investing in social enterprise probably isn't the way to maximize the return, at least in the short term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear that a lot, maximizing return. The interesting thing about foundations is that they're a function of capitalism, and we can go back to the very first foundations in the United States, the Rockefellers, the Ford, the Carnegie foundations that still exist. They were created by the most successful capitalists of the time, and in doing so, within our DNA, there is a bit of that mindset about maximizing return or maximizing investments. And it's just part of who we are. At the same time, that's not why we exist. We don't exist to maximize returns. We exist to advance the outcomes that are most important to the communities in which we serve and operate. Maximizing returns can be a tool to get us there. It's not the end game, though. You can have 15-20% returns, but if you're not having an impact in the community, then you're not serving your purpose.
Right, absolutely. One of the other phrases that I know you really love in this sector is funds under management. And when you talk to a number of community foundations, if you get a few of those CEOs in the same room, that's something that they talk about is how big is the foundation? What are the funds under management? What's your take on using funds under management as a criteria or a measure of success of a community foundation?
Yeah, again, I have to sort of go back to our DNA and capitalism. Funds under management is the terminology that you would use, or that comes from the mutual fund industry or the investment banking industry. It's actually a measure of their success. So when they say funds under management, they always want to maximize their number because they're aggregators. They're asset aggregators. That is a key success measure for the investment world. And I think it's easy to conflate community foundations with an investment management focus or orientation. We are not that. We do aggregate assets, but it's not what we're about. We aggregate assets as a means to achieving something much greater in the community. Some of the most impactful community foundations in this country or in the world are the ones that have much less assets, because to make an impact, you can do a variety of other things other than granting. It comes down to engaged boards, engaged donors, engaged community people who will mobilize and bring all sorts of capital, not just financial capital, around an issue and make something happen. So we're in the impact game, and impact can be achieved through a variety of ways that go well beyond financial.
One of the things that we hear a lot from boards is that, we need to grow, we need to get bigger. And I always say, more is not a strategy. The more that you can focus on the impact you want to have and maximizing that doesn't mean doing it more often or more deeply or for more people. It could just be making sure others see the example that you're setting and can emulate it in their own way. But the chase for more fundraising dollars and more funds under management, as you say, really isn't the end. It's not the purpose. But it does reflect in a lot of ways the success of an organization, and that a lot of the community has viewed it as a place where that can be trusted with those resources. So I think it's a balance that I'm sure community foundations all have to face, and they probably find themselves on one side of the scale or the other at different times.
Yeah, I'm a chartered accountant by trade, and when I first started working in this sector, I was really struggling with the amount of attention boards and leadership placed on financial statements in assessing the success or failure of their particular foundation or organization. The financial statements in the nonprofit sector are not a scorecard for impact. I mean, they're an indicator for a variety of other things, but they do not measure impact. Their purpose was never to measure impact. It was to measure the financial capacity and health of an organization. And oftentimes, when we use that as a measure of success, we strengthen an organization. We provide more capital and stability to that organization because we focus in on those metrics. But just because you strengthen an organization doesn't mean you strengthen a community. And I think that's where we have to develop new metrics and new scorecards. And a lot of community foundations have done this, including the one in Vancouver, that go beyond the traditional financial statements and really test out impact measurements in the community that show the true nature of their investments and the type of progress they're having.
Right. And I think the organizations that are most successful in that, or will be most successful in that, are the ones that don't come from a place of being defensive, where they say, hey, don't look at our finances. That's not where impact is measured. Look at us for something else. But I think it's really important that organizations understand that's how a lot of donors have been trained to understand their success and find a way to incorporate those financial measures with their community impact measures so that people can feel confident when they do leave the legacy or do make a gift to the foundations.
Yeah. We've been trained in philanthrocapitalism, and a lot of our language, as you mentioned, funds under management, and the way that we look at businesses is often the same way that we look at charities and foundations and nonprofits, and they're two very different things, and we can't conflate them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, now, as we come to the end of our conversation, I want to ask you to give advice to two completely hypothetical people that I'm going to make up right now. Mm-hmm. The first is someone who is about to join the board of a community foundation. And what advice would you give to somebody who wants to give back to the community, is joining a community foundation board? What are the questions they should be asking? What are the issues they should be aware of as they take their place at the board table?
I think the most important question is to ask is, how does the community determine its priorities? So what sort of engagement, conversations, data collection, trends, where are you getting your information from that informs the most pressing issues in the community? And then the second item, which is attached to that, is how is the community foundation trying to make an impact in those areas? And then that sort of forms the focus of the board. And that sort of informs whether that particular individual can be passionate about getting behind a community foundation and whether that meets their specific philanthropic needs and endeavors.
No, that I think that's great. The second person would be someone who's coming in as the new CEO of a mid to large size community foundation, new to the community, been hired to take this on. What should they be looking to accomplish in their first 30, 60, 90 days?
Yeah, I think just being out in the community. I think any community foundation CEO has to find the right networks and collaborations in order to have impact. And that's maximizing the number of conversations you're in, the number of places you're going to. And I think, 30, 60, 90 days, whatever the time frame is, the more people, the better. And I think you'll find that those relationships will become an important part of how you start to have impact over the long term.
Right. And so the final question is, you've got 191 members of your network. Who's your favorite?
Well, this is, I'll answer the question the same way that I do it for my daughters, which is to say, you're both my second favorite. That way they can always compete to see who will rise to number one.
Give them something to shoot for.
There you go.
Yeah, that probably works better in parenting than it does with community foundations.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for sharing this perspective and this education on the community foundation movement in Canada. Your repeated reminders and reference points to staying rooted in the community, reflecting the community, and focusing on the impact these organizations can have is a great reminder of really the positive benefit that philanthropy can play in Canada and around the world.
Well, thank you, Douglas. I was happy to have the conversation and appreciate the opportunity to participate.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Discovery Pod. Be sure to tune in next week for another inspiring and informative conversation. Don't forget to visit our website, thediscoverygroup.ca, for more resources. If you like what you just listened to, please subscribe and tell a friend about it. Until next time, keep working to make your organization exceptional.